Our speaker today is Chamindra Weerawardhana, who will be speaking about decoloniality, transfeminism, and love, the personal as political. So Chamindra is a political and international affairs analyst, a gender justice activist, and a chair in transgender studies fellowship recipient. She works in the areas of inclusive, reproductive justice and intersectional feminist advocacy. A Sri Lankan national, she is a research affiliate at the Center for Gender, Feminisms and Sexualities at the University College Dublin. She currently serves as a secretary to the Regional Steering Committee of the Asia Pacific Transgender Network, and she also serves as directress of Vanasa, Sri Lanka's oldest trans equality network. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chamindra Weerawardhana.
Thank you very much, Aaron Ayubuan. It's a pleasure to be here, and during this midterm season, thank you very much to all of you for being here. And so, to begin with, Aaron, thank you for that introduction of myself. So I am Sri Lankan, so I come from an island in the global south. So I would also do another territorial acknowledgement of my own, where I would say that would follow protocol and say that I would respectfully acknowledge the Lekungan peoples on whose traditional territory this university stands, and the Songhees, Eskimo, and Wasnaik peoples whose relationships with the land continue to this day. And of course, during my short stay at this institution, and in this specific intervention today, I would make it a point to be respectful of Coast Salish protocol. So I would start this dialogue with you with a reference to this very concept of territorial acknowledgement. So the territorial acknowledgement obviously is an integral part of all academic events in this institution and in all other institutions in Turtle Island, in all the territories of Turtle Island, as in across Canada. So, however, what we do need to understand is, because I'm trying to bring in my focus on what I mean by the term decoloniality, and I'm going by way of a little detour. And there's one scholar called Dr. Kucha Rising Baldy, who is from the indigenous territories across the water as such, in what we know as the United States of America. I would like to read out a quote to all of you from herself. Quote unquote, if someone came into your house one day and stole your computer and then periodically showed up and used it in front of you, how long until you're okay with that? And so you'd be like, no, don't use my computer that you stole, give it back. And now what if they were like, hey, stop being so selfish. What I'll do instead of giving it back to you is I will put a sticker on it that acknowledges that it used to be yours. And every time before I do some kind of presentation with this computer, I'd be like, I acknowledge that this computer used to belong to somebody else that I stole, and then that I stole it. So it's cool, right? So, and you go like, no, that's, just give it back. And they're like, all right, listen, selfish, how about if instead we co-manage this computer? And like, I'll write a policy and we can figure out how you can use it sometimes and how I can use it sometimes, because I like it too. And you're like, no, just give it back. And that's stolen land. So the reason why I read this out to you is also, it's got a lot to do with the current goings on in these indigenous territories. So you see people being arrested for defending their territories, and we see people having to brave this cold weather and do overnight protest campaigns. And we also see, if you go on to watch a video on YouTube, you'll see these ads popping up. And what's the ad? It's paid for by these petroleum companies. And you'd see an indigenous elder supportive of saying things that are supportive of the mining company. Right, saying that, oh, the mining company is tremendous, like they've been like grand, so they've been. So let them build the pipeline, and so that's the video you see before watching your music video or whatever on YouTube. If you log on to YouTube, like if you go on to YouTube from Victoria, from this part, probably British Columbia. So what do we see there? So we see old tactics of divide and rule. We see an agenda of exploitation of natural resources. We see we see a situation in which people are forced to protect what they hold dearest, their own land, their native territories, and it is tricky because protest there's no rights anywhere in the world that has been achieved without protest. So protest is obviously very important. However, the people who are protesting, the indigenous people of these territories, are up against something very powerful, and something that messing with that authority can land you in big trouble. So that is the nature of the context we live in. So the point I wanted to drive home before I would go into this topic that I had planned for today, decoloniality, transfeminism, and love, I wanted to draw attention to the importance of all of us engaging in a collective reflection of going beyond, the vital importance of going beyond the territorial acknowledgement in all aspects of our work. And that's easier said than done. So I've come across academics in these territories of Turtle Island who are from indigenous backgrounds, and obviously you're not someone who would be detached from the experiences that you're studying. Let's say you're from West Mount Montreal, like Trudeau country, and you study indigenous studies, then obviously you can study, you are here, indigenous studies are there. But if you are yourself affected by that, by certain, the word comes to me in French, enjeu, then life becomes harder. So I've come across people who've been told, like, see, look at your critique is too strong, like it's not very academic, you need to make it more objective, and so on and so forth. So you have to streamline your argumentation, your research design to fit in a certain institutional agenda. So there are these things going on. So we need to collectively find ways constantly of doing the work to challenge those perspectives, and to try to develop new dialogues, new ways of acknowledging the rightful owners of the land, and people who have been subjected to very sinister systemic forms of marginalization over many, many decades. So on that note, I would go to today's topic. So decoloniality, transfeminism, and love, the personal as political. And also, I would like to say, as it is the practice in this country, chers collègues et chers amis, c'est un grand plaisir aujourd'hui d'être parmi vous et je remercie la chaire en études transgenres chaleureusement de m'avoir accueilli à l'Université de Victoria. Donc bien évidemment aujourd'hui cette conférence aura lieu en langue anglaise, mais s'il y a quelqu'un qui est francophone ici, si quelqu'un veut poser une question en langue française, je serai tout à fait partante à traduire votre question et j'accueillerai chaleureusement toute question, toute discussion en langue française que je peux interpréter ou traduire simultanément. And coming back to English, what I want to share with you today focuses on two keywords, namely what I term decoloniality and what I term transfeminism. So to begin this reflection, it's important to briefly highlight what I imply by these two terms. So basically, this presentation, I wanted to keep it simple. I wanted to keep it more than a talk, more than a presentation, a dialogue between ourselves. So that is why I didn't bring in a PowerPoint presentation, because that way it becomes like a, it goes to a classroom kind of context. I wanted to go beyond that. So to put it simply, decolonial or decoloniality to me is a state of mind. It's a state of being. It's a state of it's a life ethic, and in our work contexts, a work ethic which involves challenging oppressive structures, problematic structures, calling out, critiquing, and working individually, collectively, towards dismantling certain systems that perpetuate different forms of systemic discrimination and keep on throwing marginalized people under the bus. So decolonial work, decoloniality is also about who does the work, right? Who goes and braves the cold weather and sits in front of Parliament, who writes and or challenges the mining companies' priorities, and who does the hard work, and who has the courage to stand up against a very powerful, influential, affluent government that is a very intransigent machinery. So there are all those things we need to take into account when we talk about decoloniality. And also, to me, decolonial work is also a global range of work, because the work is always local, locally grounded, and at the same time global. Because myself, coming from the global south, I see that in certain territories of what we know as India today, because there was no such thing as India before 1948, right? In India, there was Bharat, there was Hindustan, there were princely states, but a thing called India, this Orientalist fantasy of India as a republic, was carved out 1947. So in India, you have a lot of indigenous territories where people are having to face the exact same struggle that Sweden people have to face here, of mining companies, other construction companies, highway builders coming to take their land. You see a similar scenario these days with the Montagne d'Or project. It's once again a mining exploitation project run by the French government in Guyane Française, in French Guyana. And you see the same going on in the likes of Bolsonaro's Brazil. And you see similar phenomena happening in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And you could see when the bushfires were raging in the traditional indigenous territories we know as Australia, indigenous people were saying, look, we have the expertise for this. We've been managing these circumstances for many, many generations. Let us deploy our insights, our knowledge, and the government there, the authorities there are only very slowly, very, very slowly starting to listen. And So you see similar phenomena happening in loads of different places. So that is why I'm saying that it is very important for us to keep a global outlook when we do this kind of work, and whether it's be it theoretical, more academic, be it in a more hands-on activist sphere, it is important to keep that global focus in the decolonial work that we do. So it is always about challenging oppressive structures, and decoloniality, to me, it doesn't necessarily mean the end objectives of reparations, of taking the land back. At the same time, it means doing the work constantly, because these things are constant processes. So the word processes will be repeated in the course of this exchange, because the work we are doing is not an end in itself, right? I am a gender justice activist, and I could maybe there's this NGO industrial complex, about. So in our part of the world, in the global south, to do LGBT rights work, for instance, our government doesn't fund that kind of work. So where do we go? We have to go to international funders. We have to go to the Astria Foundation. We have to go to this foundation or that foundation, and solicit and request funds. And you have to you have this whole discipline of whole sector of expertise of grant writing, audits, and so on. So in that sector, you apply for funding, your grant application is successful, you get your grant, you run your project, and you do your audits and all of that, and then the next minute you have to orient your project in such a way that corresponds to the priorities of your funder, right? If not, most cases, the whole project, you can't implement your initiative, right? So at times, some of us rights activists have to just deviate a little bit from the exact work we want to do, and instead write a grant application that would appeal to such and such funder, right? Everybody does that. And so once you get the funding, you try in the best of your ability to incorporate the original thing that you wanted to do. Like, for example, nowadays, one of the major challenges in the Global South when it comes to trans communities is the issue of safe houses. A lot of people, young trans people, are thrown out of their homes, and people find it very hard to find accommodation. Like in Colombo City in Sri Lanka, this is a major issue. At Venice, for instance, our organization in Colombo, we've been struggling to run a small safe house for the community, and it is a safe house that has been an absolute lifesaver to many people. And that kind of thing, it's very hard to get it funded regularly by major havers. So you see those realities that need to be taken into account as well. So decolonial work, having a decolonial approach to that kind of work involves treading cautiously, obviously, but at the same time keeping these key objectives in mind, and focusing to the best of your ability on challenging certain structures that are not very favorable to the causes we believe in. And then, so from decolonial, I need to go to transfeminism. And the kind of transfeminism I talk about, I cannot talk about it without going somewhere else. So I would need to bring in the adjective or the qualifier intersectional, right? And I would need to focus for a little bit about this whole idea of intersectional feminism before talking about transfeminism. So, as all of you know, in these territories of Turtle Island, intersectional feminism is by and large the gift to us all from the tireless work done by Black women. So, intersectionality, it is Professor Kimberly Crenshaw who coins the term back in 1989. However, the idea of intersectionality in Black feminism dates back to goes back a long way. It goes a lot earlier than Professor Crenshaw, and this is something we need to take stock of. Back in 1851, Sojourner Truth, a woman who was born a slave, who changed her name, and at a women's convention she says, there's a very interesting quote, I'm not going to read the whole quote, but there is one line that carries very important resonances to this very day. She says, "Ain't I a woman?" Right? And so from that time onwards, to the Combahee River Collective, to Demeter Fraser, to Barbara and Beverly Smith, twin sisters, who were instrumental in writing the Combahee River Collective statement, and writers and poets, people like Audre Lorde, have contributed to the development of the set of ideas we know as intersectionality, of not having single issue lives, multiple issues, multiple identities and lived realities that intersect and intercept in terms of our lived experiences. So feminism, in that sense, feminism when qualified by intersectional is when feminism becomes like internationalist, global, and applicable to different contexts. Because if you don't do that, you're drifting in to a certain form of feminism that is obviously going to be exclusionary. And this is what we term, obviously, white feminism. And you can see certain developments, like obviously in an institution of this nature, if you run a course in feminist studies or feminist theory, and if you bring in some old school white feminist stuff, are the students going to like it? The students are going to say, you're crazy, and you can't, this is totally, you lost the plot. But if you look at the world today, you can see quite a rise of white feminist thinking. And to give you an example, one of the best examples one can come up with is from the United Kingdom. Now, there was a dialogue. It's been going on for a couple of years now. So, for gender recognition, there is a Gender Recognition Act in the United Kingdom, passed in 2004. And it is a Gender Recognition Act that pathologizes trans identities. So if you want to access gender affirming care in the United Kingdom, you have to go through a gender identity clinic, and you have to go through a psychiatric diagnosis. You have to be diagnosed of having an ailment called gender dysphoria, basically, right? So you're seen as someone with something radically wrong with you. So, and those appointments are, they're no joke. Like, they're absolutely disgusting, because I went to one place years back to a place called Brackenburn Clinic, absolutely scary place, it's in Northern Ireland. That's the only gender identity clinic for the 6 counties of Northern Ireland. And that clinic there, your woman asks you all types of personal questions about your sexuality, about your relationships, about your this, about your that, and it's very, very humiliating. Now, there was a dialogue in the United Kingdom about the possibility of changing this Gender Recognition Act of 2004 into something modern, something more 21st century, something more respectful of human rights, something more respectful of bodily autonomy, of people's right to exist, and something more modern, basically, something that is that recognizes the agency of non-cis peoples. What happened? There was an absolute shite show. Like, it was absolutely hell broke loose when this whole dialogue started, with a whole lot of people coming out expressing their opposition to any effort to take off this compulsory psychiatric diagnosis. And who were the main opponents? The main opponents were groups of cisgender women who would call themselves feminists, and obviously we know the term TERF, and we know that people call them trans exclusionary radical feminists, and my approach has been to not to call them radical. Calling them radical is absolutely problematic, because if you say a certain political organization is radical, it means it stands against the norm, right? Stands against what is considered to be the establishment. So these people, there's absolutely nothing radical about them. If there's anything about them, that's only reactionary, so you can call them reactionary. You wouldn't want to call them feminist either. So you have these people, I mean, it's a very white feminist discourse at the end of the day, because what they're saying is they come on a cis-normative basis, but if you delve into their arguments closely, you would notice that these were the same arguments that were used at a certain time in history to develop a discourse of white exceptionalism, to say that black women were inferior to white women, to see the colonized woman of color as somebody who stood there on the ground, and the white lady who stood with her dress and with her wee fan, and had the life of Riley, had the good life. So you see, the point I'm trying to make is, these people, when they come up with this very transphobic and especially trans misogynist perspectives, they come up with this discourse about women's spaces and bloody blah. If you delve into it sufficiently, you will notice, like if you're familiar with colonial history, if you're familiar with what happened in British India, what happened in these indigenous territories of Turtle Island, you can, the pin would drop. Because in here, what did they do in the first place in the 19th century till up until 1996? Residential schools. So what's the basic principle of the residential schools? Gender segregation, right? So you gender segregate children based on what's between their legs. So that completely erodes gender pluralities, diversities, different understandings of gender, different understandings of identity, different understandings of existence that would have existed in different indigenous territories of this land. And that is why there is a lot of, if you talk to, when you engage with rights activists and advocates for the rights of two-spirited people, for instance, there's a lot of, I would say, there's a lot of sadness. There's a sense of loss that you can feel in some some of my some activists who are my personal friends, who, because it is a ripping off that's been very violent, extremely violent, because you are violently ripped off centuries old social cultural traditions and protocols and norms of ways of managing. So the colonial society, to build the colonial society, Ryerson's idea was primarily, obviously you have to take the indigenous off the kid, so that's why you are forbidden to speak the native indigenous languages, for instance, in the residential schools, but at the same time gender segregate them. So obviously you could have brought in all those very depressing photographs of gender segregated spaces in indigenous schools where kids stand behind barbed wire and everything. Many of you would be familiar of those harrowing images. So what did they do in India? What did they do in Sri Lanka? For us, back home, gender segregated education is still the absolute norm. So it is like you go if you go to Western Europe today, in France, for instance, you still see old buildings that says École des filles, entrée des filles, École des garçons, entrée des garçons, but the school is co-ed, absolutely no bother. But so certain places in the world have moved on, but our people still stick to certain very Victorian, very 19th century Tom Brown's school days type norms. So where does that come from? And how does that relate to what was going on in this part of the world? So there you have it. So, and what goes on in the UK and elsewhere in places like Aotearoa about this, about trans rights, when they come up with their discourse. So there you have it. So when you take the intersectional out, when you're not prepared to engage sufficiently with the other law used to call it a traveling concept. Traveling concept is intersectionality, is something that can be applied to many different contexts. So that is the gift of black feminism, I would say. Black women did the hard work to come up with these definitions, these epistemologies that we can, with respect, with due acknowledgement, apply to certain other contexts. So if you interrogate sufficiently the idea of transfeminism, like if you go to a university in the Western world where trans rights are positively welcome, you would notice that, so if you look at a journal like the Transgender Studies Quarterly Journal, which is a very good journal, it's fantastic stuff, you'd see transfeminism defined as obviously feminist perspective that takes into account, that includes, that recognizes the agency of trans women and girls, and yeah, that's it. So whereas in what I term transfeminism, in a recent book chapter I wrote for a University of Toronto Press book that's going to come out in the summer of 2020, I call it transfeminisms, in the plural, dash of dash color, transfeminisms of color. The reason why I call it that is, what I mean by transfeminism mostly is not something that's been developed in universities. It's something that is still quite new to these conference rooms in Western universities. It's a kind of a discourse that's grounded in, I would say, activist spaces, right? People protesting on the roadside, in black feminist advocacy spaces, and also in spaces where very courageous people, especially very courageous women. When I say women, I mean cis and trans women, women of different levels of disability, women from different backgrounds, who have been doing the work on the ground. So, and most of the women who've been doing the work on the ground have been black women and women of color. So that is why I bring in this perspective of trans women of color. So if you look at transfeminism of color. So the reason why, before bringing in transfeminism, I wanted to dwell upon black feminism is, to me, transfeminism has a hell of a lot to do with black feminism. It's in fact a current that comes that was developed as part of black feminist thought, as part and parcel of black feminist thought. Because if you look at the Compartmentalise collective fundamental black feminist text, there again, the key emphasis, the major underlying emphasis of the statement is about recognizing our differences and bringing together what unites us. The sentiment that what unites us is stronger than what divides us. Audre Lorde comes up with the same thing when she talks about the lived realities of a black lesbian cisgender woman and a black straight cisgender woman. So she says, like, you're my sister, as in we have different lived experiences, right? We may not do life the same way, but there's an awful lot that brings us together. And that's why she comes up with the statement, I'm not free while any other woman is unfree, even if her shackles are very different from my own. So now you can apply that to the context of, if you apply that concept to the sphere of trans women and trans feminist advocacy, what does it give? Let's say abortion, right? Abortion rights, for many years I lived in a jurisdiction where abortion was severely restricted, the north of Ireland. So abortion severely restricted means if a 15 or 16-year-old kid makes a mistake, gets pregnant, needs to either travel to England, so you have to prepare the luggage and everything and go on the ferry or the plane to England for an abortion, and the National Health Service in England doesn't cover it, so you have to prepare the money to pay which is about a couple of £1,000, and then you go through that whole experience of the abortion, and then you had to come back home, and then you had to focus on your life. And so not many people could afford it to begin with. And the number of people who had to, give up their right to bodily autonomy, people who did not want to be in a situation of pregnancy at a certain point, but were forced to carry the baby to the completion of the pregnancy till childbirth. That number is tremendous. So it's a very oppressive place. Now, if, let's say, abortion rights from a trans feminist of colour perspective, inspired by black feminism, that earlier black feminist perspective of what unites us is stronger than what divides us. For myself personally, for instance, having an abortion may not be something that concerns me physically, personally. However, if you follow the Lord's advice, if there is a woman in Aotearoa or in the north of Ireland or back home in Sri Lanka where there's still strict abortion legislation, her struggle, which is different from my struggle, automatically becomes my struggle, right? And I would need to campaign for as part of her struggle for her, and stand with her, and respect her agency and help out in the best possible way. Now, vice versa, if you apply that to trans rights, if you apply that to gender affirming care, if you apply that to gender self-determination, whether you're cis or trans does not matter. It is something that involves the fundamental rights of another woman or another human being, and you do what you need to do to be supportive. And this is what black women, black feminists have done. Like if you look at the work of Professor Angela Davis, her work, the major body of work on prison abolition and against the prison industrial complex in the United States, that body of work has always included a very strong focus on trans women. If you look at the work of this side of the border, if you look at the work of Robin Ménard, Robin Ménard is an academic from Montreal, and her book Policing Black Lives, Noirs sous surveillance, there's a French translation as well. It's the most comprehensive account to date of police violence towards black people in Canada. And that book includes a very strong focus on trans women. And if you look at the case of Marsha P. Johnson, in 1970, in front of a hospital over in New York, Bellevue Hospital, where there were a lot of people facing healthcare issues, it was a gay liberation front protest. Marsha Johnson was carrying this, there's this very famous photograph of herself carrying this this poster saying power to the people. And when a journalist or reporter asked, what people do you mean? Like, is it just trans people, or what exactly do you mean? She says, very simply, all people. So there again, black trans women struggles, always the focus has been on an inclusive level. So if you look at the work of black trans women and trans women of color in most parts of Turtle Island today, that legacy continues. When Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, a couple of years back, said something very stupid at a press interview, right? And your woman, the reporter woman asked some question. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is asked a question about trans women, and she responds, like, goes ahead with the reporter's agenda, head on, like. And Chimamanda says something which I don't want to repeat, and there was a lot of there was a dialogue, public dialogue about this. And one of the best critiques of Chimamanda's comments, and one of the most supportive comments or critiques supportive towards trans women came from someone called Jade Almeida, who is a black cis woman, queer woman, Afro-feminist activist from the French-speaking Caribbean, from Guadeloupe, who is based in Montreal. right? So that's black feminism for you. That's trans feminism of color. As in, whether you're cis or trans does not matter, the fact that you're on the right place in terms of what you believe in and how you stand for the rights of how you stand for your feminist objectives is what matters. And this is what black feminist advocates from Angela Davis downwards to people who are involved in activist work today, cis women like Shanice Nicole, to trans women like Kim Ninkuru. These are people who are doing great work in Canada today, here and now, and this is what their work teaches us. So this is what I try to conceptualize as trans feminisms of color. Now, when you say trans feminism, it is also a feminist discourse that fundamentally challenges and rattles the gender binary. That's why a lot of, that's why white feminism has a problem with it, right? That's why they come up with, oh my God, the women's spaces, what the hell's going to happen? Like the very colonially imposed spaces, right? So the point there is, trans feminist discourses are feminist discourses that completely challenge certain established systems. So now if you are to come up with a trans feminist discourse that takes into account the importance of challenging the gender binary, right? You turn the gender binary basically upside down. If you are to apply that principle to a school, obviously you'd want to make the school trans inclusive. You'd need to acknowledge the fact that there are some children who are cis, some children who are not cis, so that their agency needs to be respected. So certain practices that certain countries have about school uniforms, for instance, very dogmatic practices would need to change. New policies would have to be brought in. Hospitals, my God, hospitals, maternity units will have to change. So maternity units, where you constantly talk about, the pregnant mothers, you'll have to talk about the pregnant fathers as well. So you'll have to bring in new legislation that allows to say where in a birth certificate, in a traditional birth certificate where it would say the birth giver would always appear as the mother, then you'd have to create new birth certificates where the birth giver should appear, has to appear imperatively as father. So there you challenge the systems in place, and then the services provided in these spaces would need to be challenged. So the entire healthcare system, which is a healthcare system that prioritizes a certain level of cis masculinity, like that's why, for instance, like pain felt by women is very seldom taken into account. That's why innovation in gynecology, for instance, is slow. So gynecology as a discipline was one that was built on the bodies of black women, right? This is why medical doctors experimenting on black women without their consent, without anesthesia, with nothing. That is how the knowledge we have of gynecology today has been built. That is why, so the gendered way in which the healthcare system is built will have to be challenged. Jesus, it's a lot of work to do. So that is why people tend to show a lot of skepticism when it comes to bringing in these discourses to public life, and so that's where the decolonial dimension of transfeminisms of color lies in. Like I said earlier, decolonial is all about challenging established structures, oppressive structures, right? If someone goes to give birth now, back home in Sri Lanka, there was a case where a tuk-tuk driver, yourselves know what a tuk-tuk is, the three-wheeler, it's a wee thing with the three wheels, right? And a tuk-tuk driver fella went to hospital, was admitted to hospital, and then he happened to be a man of trans experience, and he delivered a baby in a hospital. And what did the media do? The media went absolutely crazy. They were publishing sensational news reports saying a man has given birth in a hospital in a very sensationalist way, in a very problematic way, right? And so then again, if you are to apply a trans feminist of color perspective, there again you would need to trans feminist to court perspective, you'd need to challenge the ways in which the system is run, how things are reported, and how to normalize these experiences and lived experiences and existences. So for that is where you need to bring in a perspective of decolonial perspective on health services, right? What does it mean to engage in decolonial healthcare advocacy? Decolonial healthcare advocacy in Turtle Island would involve a complete overhaul of what we know as healthcare in Canada. Because what is healthcare in Canada today? A girl with or a birth giver, especially a cis girl with a record of drug use or whatever, gives birth, and what happens? The whole lot of them come and take the baby away soon after giving birth. So you see, YouTube and Facebook's replete with videos of mothers who've just given birth, Indigenous women, rightful owners of this land, crying their eyes out when their baby is being taken away. And that kind of reality would have to be very strongly challenged. Such things wouldn't happen, there would be no space for such things to take place if you bring in a trans feminist perspective. And that is why I say that, that's why I wrote an article in 2017 in the Meridians Journal saying profoundly decolonizing. That's the opening title of the article, looking at trans feminist perspectives, and in the case of that particular article, on international relations. But if you apply a trans feminist perspective to anything, it is invariably decolonial. You cannot talk about trans feminist objectives or trans feminist future or trans feminist advocacy without having a strong decolonial feminist focus. And good Lord, what's wrong with this? There we are. Apologies. So those are the key concepts that I wanted to bring in to this dialogue today, to share with yourselves. So the work that I'm doing here this month at the Trans Studies Chair, I'm completing a manuscript of a book that's called Trans Politics, Parenting and Family Lives, Decolonial Perspectives. And that is precisely a work in progress where I try to develop a trans feminist perspective of reproductive justice, where you systematically challenge certain practices. Like if you take a trans feminist of color perspective, you can identify certain commonalities. Like someone like myself, I am a mother of 2 young children, aged 8 and 5, and myself, that's a motherhood that is systematically challenged by a load of people, right? And I've been told things that are absolutely horrible things, that I don't have rights, I am not their mother, I am this, I am that, so many things. So a trans woman being a mother, a trans woman assuming her role as mother is seen very negatively. If you look into black cis women's experiences of motherhood, it's not very dissimilar. Go to the Réunion Island that belongs to France in the Indian Ocean. Réunion Island, there's been a very long historic and present day controversy of black women being forcibly sterilized. If you look at the experiences of Indigenous women in these territories of Turtle Island, so many cis women go to give birth in hospitals, and what happens? They come home after being sterilized without their consent. In the prairies, it's still an issue on occasion. So these are not historic issues, these are present day challenges. So these challenges exist and persist. So if you look at the experience of a trans woman trying to avail of her reproductive rights, experience of a trans man who's trying to avail of his reproductive rights, and if you see the experience of an Indigenous woman in God love her if she's in the prairies, herself trying to avail of her reproductive rights, a black woman in the Réunion Island trying to avail of her reproductive rights, don't you see the similarity of the shared challenges involved? So that is where I bring in the global decolonial feminist focus into the work that I do. So now coming to the latter section of what I have to share with yourselves is the concept of love, the personal as political. So Black feminism has always included a very strong focus on love. And so there's the concept of, to begin with, the concept of black love, because there's been an awful lot of hatred that's been floated, and love has been something difficult to share in deeply oppressed communities. I mean, this applies to indigenous communities as well. For example, people who have absolutely beautiful children and who have lovely families, but certain traumas of having lived through living hell in residential schools persist, and people being, perpetuating the violence they experience towards their children. Like, you hear stories of that nature very often, used to hear those at least, often in Turtle Island. So what I'm trying to say is, so black love, black people, loving each other, in itself is, to certain black feminist writers, something very special. Now, if you delve into black feminism a little bit more, there is a very strong concept of love as in, sisterhood, right? Black feminist sisterhood. Now, Audre Lorde talks a lot about sisterhood in I Am Your Sister, as in challenging certain established assumptions about cisness, about transness, in Audre Lorde's case about being lesbian and being straight. But it's in latter-day activist work, this has been extended to a range of lived realities where you find love, you find affection, you find sisterhood, you find community across difference. And this is a major black feminist principle. And the concept of love in that sense is deeply important. So developing sisterhoods across differences that divide us, and finding what unites us in love is the core aspect of black feminist work. Now, if you look at the writings of Alice Walker, for instance, you'll see a whole range of examples to this kind of principle. If you look at the writings also of Teresia Taiva is she was an amazing woman who used to teach at Victoria University of Wellington in Te Whanganui-a-Tara in Aotearoa. And Dr. Taiva passed away in 2017, and herself was a very good poet. She used to write beautiful poetry. She was an expert in international affairs and Pacific studies, and she did a PhD in the States, and her supervisor was Professor Angela Davis. So Angela Davis, in her obituary note, says, "I learned a lot from her than she learned from me." And Teresia Taiva's work, she's lived in so many different places in the Pacific, across from Hawaii to Fiji to Kiribati to Aotearoa. So herself as well brings in, Teresia's poetry is also one that brings in this concept of love across borders, love across difference, and finding affection, finding care, caring contexts and spaces. I think my take, the reason why I want to bring in the aspect of love into today's exchange is, if you look at what's happening in downtown Victoria today, for instance, that would be a case that shows very strongly the importance of love. Love as in caring, as in nurturing a certain support networks and being there for someone and being supportive of the struggles of a certain community. Now that's the political, right? Now what about the personal? Now about the personal, let's focus on non-cis people. Many of us non-cis people are conditioned in this very cis, very het society to see ourselves as not very worthy of love, right? including myself, right? This has been the lived experience of many of us. So cishet society says, encourages us very tacitly at times in a very, very, very aggressive, passive-aggressive way, in a way in which we don't even know where that thought came from to our minds. It's a society that encourages us to conceptualize our bodies as not very attractive, or as non-cis bodies as not very appealing sexually or in any other way, and that we are not very worthy of love, of affection in our personal spheres. Now, some of us get to, it's a privilege in the world in which we live today. It's an absolute privilege to be able to challenge those notions and to do the work to deconstruct those notions and to find ways of, find love towards yourself first, and then love with someone you want to share your life with. So at times, many non-cis people come across scenarios that are very problematic, such as where you're involved with a cis person in your personal sphere, and the cis person going like, "You should be grateful for me being with you." So there have been cases like that. I would know that from personal experience. So what does that say? What that says is that love as a concept is something that should occupy a central place in our work in the sector of trans rights advocacy, and very specifically in relation to what I was saying earlier, to trans feminist advocacy, or to be a bit more specific, trans feminist or color advocacy, because of very systemic challenges that people face in the political and in the personal spheres. So the whole point here is about finding yourself, as in finding ways of challenging certain notions that try to that are hell-bent on demeaning or downgrading non-cisness and taking pride in being who you are, a non-cis person, full-fledged citizen, fully worthy of love, fully worthy of affection. And this is something that should not be the exception. It should be the norm. It should be something normal. So to normalize love and care, especially for our communities, for non-cis communities, for queer communities, is part and parcel of, should be part and parcel of feminist work, of decolonial work. And that is where, we need to find love and caring and supportive spaces in the political and also in the personal. And it is not always easy. It is a challenging body of work. I myself have had the privilege of getting to do that work in the personal sphere, especially partners in the room here as well. So, and it is something where we need to engage in deconstructing, challenging certain established assumptions, and challenging our own selves to think differently, to approach things differently. And for instance, society tries to put people, especially non-cis people, in so many boxes. Like just the other day I was watching this film about this girl, it's called The Girl, I think it's on Netflix, about a trans girl in Belgium who is learning to become a ballet dancer. And so she goes to this very high-profile dance school over in Brussels, and the challenges she faces. And at one point there is this scene where a therapist or some kind of psychiatric psychological support worker having a dialogue with this girl. A cis man is asking her, and she says, the guy doesn't even, he goes head on and asks her, "What kind of boys do you like?" And so the conception there is very clearly, okay, like she's a trans girl, right? So she likes only boys. What kind of boys? Like cis boys, right? And so a very general misconception that there is in society is that, okay, like you're a trans man, okay, you're attracted to cis girls. So what does that mean? And if you're a trans woman, you're obviously attracted to cis men, and that's the story. What does that mean? So a sexuality, a gender identity is conceptualized in such a narrow way, as in, so you're non-cis, so your sexuality has to revolve around cisness, right? That's the principle there. That's the underlying rationale there. So these things need to be challenged through a decolonial, trans feminist, a queer feminist lens, and the work of Black feminist activists, Black trans feminist activists, writers are a great set of resources that enable us to find inspiration to do that work in the personal and in the political and in public life, in the public sphere as well. So to wrap this up, what I wanted to share with you was the one basic reality that when we think decolonial, because people like to think in a compartmentalized way, so that's why I coined this topic in this way, because all of us live, we don't live single issue lives, but we live compartmentalized lives most of the time. Because, for example, for myself, a woman of trans experience who is queer, who works in the Global South and also on occasion in these territories, in Turtle Island and in the British Isles. To myself, and also being French speaking, if I do get to work in the Francophone sphere. I'm involved with this organization in Montreal called EGID, which is an international Francophone LGBT activist collective. And that is the space where I get to interact with my Francophone activist colleagues from the Global South, right, who are just literally across the water from me in the African continent, over in West Africa. And to go from where I live in Sri Lanka to West Africa, I'd need to first go to Paris, most probably, and fly from there, or I'd need to go to the Middle East and fly from there. And within the African continent, to go from a place like Bamako in Mali to a place like Nairobi in Kenya, you want to go from Bamako to Nairobi, which should be a couple of hour flight, but it's very complicated. So it is. You have a better chance of flying from Bamako to Paris or to Brussels, and then flying back from, then going to maybe London, and then flying from London to Nairobi. So that is how connectivities are, that's how people are put in boxes. So it's very hard for activists to interact. So when we get the opportunity to interact with, like, let's say, my colleagues who are, women running women's support organizations in places like Bamako, their lived experiences, struggles to find funding, struggles to find support are very similar to struggles we face back home. Because in places like Abidjan, in Bamako, in Dakar, Senegal, most of the funding that's provided by the Western embassies and everything, they want to tick the box, right? So they are supportive of LGBT rights organizations that are like cis gay heavy or cis lesbian heavy, for instance. But if you want to run a women's organization, there's an organization called Femmes d'Espoir Mali, founded by a very dear friend of mine. Very hard to find funding. Now that's a very inclusive, intersectional feminist organization that is supportive of queer women, women as in cis, trans, queer, across intersectional identities. Very hard to find support. So we live compartmentalized lives. So when we look at certain concepts, certain epistemologies in the university world, again, we look at things in a compartmentalized way. if you're doing international relations, if you're doing a PhD in international relations, and if you're looking at feminist IR, very few people would be inclined to take into account certain aspects of what I would call intersectional feminist IR, or black feminist IR, or if not trans feminist IR. What would a concept of a perspective of trans feminist IR look like? Very few people go there. If you look at decolonial advocacy, people in this part of the world, in Turtle Island, do fantastic work in and outside universities. However, very few people would be inclined to look at things in a comparative perspective and say, look, the decolonial challenges that we face here, when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to protecting the land, when it comes to protecting natural resources, there's an awful lot in common with what's going on in certain places in the global south. So that kind of dialogue is always hard. It's not easy, and very few of us especially trans and queer communities as a whole, it is important to acknowledge that myself here, as a woman of color, as a non-cis woman of color, I do face certain barriers, certain challenges. I'm quite a few years into my PhD, growing publication profile, peer-reviewed and everything, but I'm not on a full post in a university. And whenever I apply to a full post in something like gender studies, it's mostly a holiday trip for me, because I do get called for interviews. And when I go into the room, when I see the face of the people, and when I see the type of questions they ask, I know, all right, you've already made your decision. You invited me here to tick a box. So that's a holiday trip for me, because they pay the hotel and the room. So the final point I would wish to make is that globally, very few of us, trans and queer people, get to. So those are challenges that I face myself. However, standing here on this podium, I also stand on a lot of privilege compared to many trans and queer people across the world, especially if you look at my part of the world, in terms of the ability to communicate with yourselves in a language that is foreign to me, that is not a language that is not my native language, and also the ability to crisscross certain transnational spaces. When you're a non-cis person, it's a very small percentage of us who get to go to these international conferences, who get to go to international platforms, who get to work on a regional, transnational, supranational basis. And these are things that we need to take into account. So that is where, when we look into, because this is the chair in transgender studies, right? So there is always a chair has a community focus. The chair is very close to local communities, as Aaron rightly said, like an awful lot of events taking place where events are public. It's not a university focused, theoretically focused, ivory tower type structure. It's a structure that speaks to the community, that engages with the community locally, nationally, and globally. So that's where I really wanted to drive home this final point, that it is very important when we think of trans rights, when we think of looking after our communities, when we think of looking after our chosen families, as in trans and queer people worldwide, it is very helpful and very important, in my opinion, to be conscious of decolonial feminist thought, and also especially black feminist perspectives, and also what I would call trans feminist of color perspectives. So that brings me to that brings what I wanted to say to an end, and I would be very happy to share certain publications that I've written about trans feminist perspectives on development work, on international relations, and also a critical dialogue on what trans feminisms of color really implies. Like, that's the publication that's coming out later this year. If you want to see a copy of it, advanced copy of it, I'd be very happy to share those things with yourselves. And thank you very much for your attention.